Our next guest is Mr. Daryn Leas. Daryn is a member of the Yukon First Nation and has worked as legal counsel for almost 3 decades. And for people that don't know what a decade, that's almost 30 years. Specializing in constitutional, environmental, employment, and administrative law as they apply to issues affecting First Nations. In Yukon, Daryn is recognized for his instrumental work advising several Yukon First Nations on negotiation and implementation of their land claim and self-government agreements, and has been involved in settlements for specific claims, the development of community constitutions, and negotiations on resource transfer agreements. In addition, Daryn has been a chief legal counsel for the Council of Yukon First Nations, an instructor at the Yukon College, a past vice chair of the Yukon Council on Economy and Environment, and so much more. Today, we look at Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow and what it means to someone who has been very instrumental in negotiations, implementation, and governance in reality. So welcome, and please join me, Mr. Daryn Leas. Daryn, it's great to have you on the comfy couch today, my friend. So for the listeners that may not know who you are, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and the journey that you're currently on?
Well, I'm really pleased to be here this afternoon. So it's nice to see so many faces out there, a lot of people that have had a lot of influence in my development as a lawyer and a person. So it's pleased to see everybody. I was born and raised in Whitehorse. As you said, I'm a Trondheim citizen. I live part-time in Whitehorse, part-time in Vancouver. I have 4 kids. I have 1 German Shepherd. Much to the chagrin of my girlfriend, I say the German Shepherd is the most important female in my life. And I've been doing this work for it's amazing to think the time has slipped by so quickly, 30 years. It's been a wonderful journey. It's been it's been a privilege to do this work, and it's been really personally rewarding and professionally rewarding, of course, to be able to have input into this work and have a small role into what we see today. And, you know, even in my lifetime, seeing the changes that have happened in the Yukon is pretty overwhelming and really gratifying to see how far we've come. But of course, we've got a long ways to go still. So that's a little bit about my background. Yeah,
for sure. And obviously someone that's been involved for this long. How much have we changed as Yukon First Nations going back even just to even 1993 in the Umbrella Final Agreement? From your perspective, how far have we not only advanced our positions, but also regained our identity here, particularly in the territory, but let alone in a national context?
Well, you know, I go back to like 1996, 97. I was working at that time with Ron Vale, and I saw him here. He's over there. And he said, you should go talk to people in Carcross-Taggart. You should go talk to Albert James. And, you know, they might need some help doing they're thinking about potentially doing entering into negotiations, and I did. And for me, that was the one community that I worked with right from the beginning of their negotiations until they were ratified. And I did that also with Ton and Trondheim and a couple other First Nations. But for Carcross, was a really, to me, it's a very personal file. I was born in that, or raised in that community as a youngster. I know a lot of people. But when I went there in 97, 98, the infrastructure really struck me. It was like going back in time in some respects, because I had been working at CYFN for some time and working with my own First Nation. But with Carcross, it was really at the beginning, and there wasn't the infrastructure there. They didn't have an office. They had a duplex that, you know, the offices were in. There was the bedrooms were the offices. There weren't doors. There were curtains across the doors. It was, you know, we've all seen that, and walked into that. And now when I go down to Carcross and I see, you know, them as decision makers with respect to resource matters, see the wealth that they have, see the revitalization of their poles from people like Keith Wolf-Smarch and others, and his son Aaron and others who have done that work down there. It's a completely different world, and you've seen that happen over 25 years. It puts things into perspective of what a difference we can make in such a short period of time. And seeing their young people in their dance groups and their kids that go to school, and it can be at times a little overwhelming, and as I said earlier, extremely rewarding. So I think we've come a million miles, quite frankly. We've come 100 years and 25 years, in a lot of respects. And now I see the Carcross-Tagish people, using their language, being involved in the largest companies in the Yukon as investors, making decisions with respect to the land management in Carcross, and seeing a healthier, happier community. Of course, a lot of work still to do on all those matters, but that's what I see, and that's what it really drives me. And really, the message I take, not just from one First Nation to another in the Yukon, but the work I do in British Columbia, Alberta, and Northwest Territories, because a lot of people look to the Yukon. That's one thing that we don't realize when we work here all the time, is that the trails that we've broken, a lot of people are following them, and a lot of people are learning. I get calls all the time as a lawyer from self-governing nations, new self-governing nations in British Columbia. They want to know about how we manage our money through the trusts. Mm-hmm. They want to know about the laws that we've enacted in places like Carcross Tagish that really reflect self-government and a different way of managing your land's resources and engaging with your communities. It's pretty fascinating. I'm really proud of the work that the people in this room and the people who've been involved in land claims not just on the First Nation side, but the people who worked for government and worked with us to implement these agreements. It's not always been easy, but we've done that in partnership. And some of the really exciting things that we're doing now on things like the First Nation School Board, working with Minister McLean and others, is we're breaking new trails and creating some really fascinating opportunities, not just for our community, but for our young people. Of course, it's tough at times to see some of the other issues that we're dealing with and some of the things that we need to focus on. It's one thing to have strong governments, and it's one thing to have wealth in your community. But I think for all of us that have been involved in this, the challenge now is to really focus on child welfare, focus on education, and focus on health and wellness, because we need our people strong. We didn't come all this way to deal with grief week after week. It's tough for all of us. Yeah. But I think now we've got the tools. We just need the political will from our community and from our leadership to really focus on these really difficult issues. And I think we're starting to do some of that work. And I think we can do the same thing we did on governance and on wealth and on resource management, and apply it to these other difficult issues that we're currently facing that need our immediate attention.
For sure. And implementation, obviously, since 95 has been the focus, but part of the key component to building, our key component to implementation is building community. And CYFN last night celebrated our staff dinner, which obviously it was great to hear the stories of building community and building, not only advocating for our rights as Indigenous and First Nation people, but there was always that sense of community, even before we had all the money and all the bells and whistles. For you as an individual, what was CYFN, what did it mean to you coming into the doors back when you were a youth, let alone as someone that was now working, for the cause, if you will?
Well, CYFN, for me was incredibly important as a person. When I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and I started working, if you can believe this, my first job I had at CYI at the time, was 40 years ago. 1983, I came there as a summer student to do archaeology with Jeff Hunston. Oh. And it changed my life. It really did. I went into this room and was inspired by, the archaeological office department with Jeff was in the mapping room. So we had, people like Gerald Isaac and Wilbur Smarch and Albert Weber and that crew. And it was fascinating. And I saw Dave Joe walking around, and I saw Wayne Jim as a young person there. And I saw all these people. I saw everybody in this room there. And I was working that summer with Sheila Joe. And it was fascinating it became a big part of my identity. It showed me that people were working hard and people were proud of their Native heritage. And it was, I think it's hard to put into words the impact it had on me. And ever since those 40 years, over the last 40 years, I've been a big guy about CYFN and the need for unity and the need to ensure we're working together. Because I think in my own view, the things that we've done and the things we've done well in the Yukon have been done together, and I see us coming together again, and I know that there's a lot of differences, but we can overcome those differences. Our strength is our unity. People have said that over and over. And CYFN over the years has changed from being negotiator to more of an implementer to now more of facilitating discussions, bringing people together, coordinating things. And it's there always has to be a role for some central entity of sorts to support communities, to be a think tank, to develop policy. And the things that we've done, and together today for Children's Tomorrow are well known, the land claim agreements and everything else, but there's been a lot of other things that CYFN has done over the years, the economic development initiatives, some of the housing work that was done years ago by people like Albert, by Bill. And some of that work has been really fascinating as well, and the justice work. And then, of course, the other stuff we've done, things like devolution. Yeah. And a lot of people don't really understand the nature and scope of that devolution agreement that was negotiated in 2003, or the oil and gas agreement that was done in 1998, where we were able to get very important concessions from the territorial and federal governments about dealing with gaps that were in the land claim agreement. Things like warranties on the lands that we retained under the land claim agreement for long-term, for hazardous waste sites. Issues about, fighting forest fires on settlement lands. Issues about, well, how do we develop new legislation if we agree that the Yukon government's going to have this new jurisdiction over lands and resources and oil and gas? Well, we've developed new legislation, and we're currently doing that on mining and with lands. And when we look back at the oil and gas legislation that we developed with the Yukon government 25 years ago, there was like a legislative veto in that legislation at that time that we negotiated, which if you didn't have a land claim agreement in your traditional territory, the Yukon government would not be able to authorize any oil and gas permits or licenses without your consent. That was 25 years ahead of UNDRIP, which is kind of where we are now with, it was fascinating. The enhanced consultation provisions, a requirement in legislation for benefit agreements. That's the thinking that we can bring to protect our rights, and sort of the partnership we see with governance with the Yukon government. Unfortunately, in some cases, we had a period with the Yukon government party, the Yukon party, which disengaged with us, and we weren't able to advance some of the commitments that we set out in devolution, including developing new mining legislation, land legislation, and water legislation. And in fact, even went further to repeal the legislative veto that applies to the Kaska and to the White River First Nation. Those are challenges for us, but it doesn't take away from what we can do when we do have a government that is willing to work with us. And I think that is changing, because over time what we've seen with the Yukon government is let's be fair, Yukon First Nations aren't the only government in Yukon that lack capacity. The Yukon government does in a big way as well. And when they received devolution, they received new authorities for managing land and resources throughout the Yukon, which was previously managed by the federal government. They received about $40 million and 240 some jobs. Kind of got plopped on them April 1st, 2003. They had this new immense responsibilities. Guess what? They messed it all up. That's why we went to the Supreme Court of Canada twice, and on Peel and on a case dealing with Little Salmon Carmacks. And on top of that, the Yukon government has been struggling dealing with self-government, which is not a surprise. The biggest provincial governments in Canada, Ontario and British Columbia, struggle with it as well. So we're all kind of learning as we're going. There's going to be some hiccups. We just have to continue, as one of my colleagues, Victor McHenry, used to say, you just put your head down and go straight into that snowstorm one step at a time, and just keep working away, and don't deviate from what you believe is right and what you believe is necessary for your communities to excel and for your people to be healthy and have a brighter future, right? I think that's what we're all here for, and that's what people came together 50 years ago, and 50 years before that, people came together to, work in the best interests of their communities long before there was contact. Yeah. This is nothing new for Aboriginal people in the Yukon, coming together, dealing with new challenges, dealing with changes, and ensuring that we have a brighter future, right?
Yeah, for sure. And then with obviously with the deliverance of Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow in 73 on February 14th, my father has made the comment that it was only going to take 6 months, but it ended up taking 20 years. What was the significance of doing it right and taking the time to not only pick through a lot of the details, let alone to ensure that our rights and, and interests were protected, but also going to be advanced for the next 50 years?
Yeah, I think the one thing that we've all learned is that we're never going to get it right, 100% right. It's a work in progress, and there will come a time when I'll hand it off to other people. We're already doing that, and they'll step up and they'll take the place of Bill and Adeline and everybody else and Judy, because I was in their shadows, and somebody else is going to step out of my shadow and pick up that baton and move it forward. It's never ending. All governments, all communities have got issues. We've got frictions between communities. Not only with YG, but amongst ourselves, right? We've got overlap concerns and, competing interests. It's ongoing. That's what governance is. Mm-hmm. And it is a journey. And as long as we're working together for the right objectives, listen, we're not going to agree on everything, but if we can agree on some core issues, we want a better future for our kids. We want a healthy economy. We want a place where our people can be themselves and exercise their rights. If we can agree to that, we can continue to make the Yukon the best place in the world to live, right?
Yes.
And if other people come, that's great. What have we had? 10,000 new people in the last 10 years coming to the Yukon? And that's a challenge, right? Because it took a long time for Yukoners to get their heads wrapped around how the land claim agreement benefits them. And it does. They sit on our boards and committees. They work with us in managing our lands and resources. We were here in this room, 10 years ago when the federal government was trying to change the ESSA legislation and sort of gut it out, and Stephen Harper's agenda to basically remove environmental assessment and protections through the Fisheries Act and from the Northwest Territories assessment legislation and, of course, ESSA here. We stood up in this room and people were really, at that time, hesitant to, and I think you were chairing that meeting, actually. People were hesitant on the First Nation side to have a public meeting to talk about this issue because our previous public meetings were around UFA in the early 90s, and they weren't great meetings, right? There was a lot of different points of view that were raised there. And we held the meeting here, and some of us are saying, let's do it because this is the right thing to do, and we need to involve everybody. And the room filled up that night, and we spoke about it, and we stood up and said, this agreement is not just about Aboriginal people, it's about you as well. It's your agreement. It deals with lands and resources throughout the Yukon, not just on settlement land. And I think to everybody's surprise, the room, for the large part, enthusiastically endorsed that. And that's when we knew that, hey, people are getting it. And now we have to continue to do that work. And that's part of the challenge of governance, is educating the public and governments to understand what our values are and really what we're trying to achieve. And when you have new people coming in all the time, you have to start again because there's a lot of different points of view here, and a lot of them, quite frankly, and from my point of view, are uninformed and don't really understand the land claim agreements. And it's a little demoralizing to have to explain it all the time, but that's okay. Yeah. Because if people live here and if they're open-minded and willing to learn from us and learn that we're all on the same page and that have recognition and respect for Aboriginal and treaty rights, we can make this a great place. So I see that as one of the ongoing challenges for not just First Nation governments, but also for the Yukon government as well. That's why things like what's it called? There's a public relations sort of campaign that was underway, mapping the Yukon or mapping the way, which was, I think, a fantastic thing, and that needs to continue to get our message out there so people understand what the origins of the land claim agreement were. And I think this week will open the eyes of a lot of people. They'll understand, because not a lot of people understand the movement, the journey that we've been underway, the work that we've been doing for not just 50 years, it goes beyond that, right? It goes all the way back to Jim Boss's letter, and it goes back before that, even that in 1902. What I think the interesting work going forward, and it's great to have this 50-year sort of step back and say, wow, we've come a long ways. But I think what we really need now is a new Together Today for our children tomorrow. Where are we going for the next 50 years? And people say, well, our land claim and our self-government agreement set that out, and that's correct. But it's broader than that, right? I think that creating a civil society that is truly reflective and accommodating for everybody is really where we want to go. And I think that's the next step. And that's really the purpose of reconciliation, right? Supreme Court of Canada has made it very clear. That's what treaties are about. They're about reconciliation. They're about integrating our experiences, no matter how painful and difficult they've been, into the larger society. And I think that's really where our focus needs to be going forward. It's going to be a challenge. Like I look in the room and I see a lot of Aboriginal people here, but I don't see a lot of our other, some of the newer people to the Yukon here, and I think that's great. Well, welcome. A few of you. No, but I also mean, people who've moved here in the last 10, 15 years, right? There's huge segments of new ethnic groups here, and that's great. New immigrants, that's great. And I'd love to see them here as well and to learn. Because elders have always stated, we've welcomed people. We tried to help people. We helped people when they first came here to live and prosper and to develop their homes here. And if we don't do it, we end up with situations where people don't understand cultural norms, where they think you can fish and take a 50 grayling out of a lake, which we've heard before, or people don't know, things like that they need to understand who we are. And I think that's the next step. Reconciliation, bringing our community tighter together. Man, there's only 40,000 of us, and you know what? We live, as I said earlier, the best place in the world. And we can make it better. We can make it a lot better. And I truly believe that.
Cheesh, and if you're just tuning in to Shone FM or Facebook Live, you're listening to the 50th anniversary of Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow speaker series, and we have Daryn Leas live here in the studio. You talk about challenges, and not only the challenges that we have to deal with the federal government, but there's always equally as important in challenges within us as an organization. Can you take us back to the 95 Constitution, and why were there people reluctant to move on with us as an organization? Unless you're embargoed, of course. But
no, what's interesting is that I became involved more directly at CYFN right after that in 1996. I had the real privilege of Harry Allen actually said, "Hey, come work for us." And that's the thing I loved about CYFN is, and I think we're still that way, welcoming, bringing people in, mentoring them, and all the people I worked with, and it started with Harry. But 1995 was a difficult year, right? And it's interesting, there's been some CBC news stories about different perspectives of the Casca and their perception of the land claim agreement. And it's good to see that. It's good to see them get their story out there and their view, because they have a unique perspective, a unique experience. Their people are in British Columbia, the Northwest Territories, and the Yukon. I understand why they want to have one agreement for their people. I understand the concerns that the White River First Nation had. The issue is when we draw lines in the sand about who's a member of CYFN and who's not, it's not that helpful. And I think if we could go back in time, I think a lot of us would suggest that, listen, we needed a little bit more time to get everybody comfortable to move forward. Because once you leave, whether it's Cornland done in 1995 along with the Casca, it's awfully hard to come back formally. Now, the door is open. The door is open, and we participate and we work with representatives from nations who are not part of CYFN formally, but they're there. They're at every leadership meeting. They come to our GAs. They're welcome. Sometimes they ask the toughest questions, and that's good.
Yeah.
And we never want to shut the doors. And it's not for me to second guess. I wasn't there in 1995. You can ask your next guest, Mr. Joe, because he would have been sitting there. But I also understand that people were tired. People had put 20 years into negotiations, and we were that close, right, to moving towards the next round of land claim agreements being negotiated. And I think we've learned from that you can't push ahead. You can only go as fast. Your pace can only go as fast as the comfort level of the person at the very end of the line,
or the community, for that matter.
The entire community, for sure. And I've experienced that myself in some of the land claim negotiations in places like Carcross, where it was there was very different points of view as to whether or not that was the appropriate path to follow. And you got to work it through. It's tiring. It takes a lot of effort. And again, I don't have to tell people in this room about that. It's really tiring to engage in that, not just meeting after meeting or month after month, but sometimes year after year.
Yeah.
But it's what our strength has always been. And I think that's reflected in our decision making, which is consensus based. I can't even remember the last time at CYFN where we actually had to have a vote on decisions, right? If people are not comfortable with it, we take the time to ensure that they are comfortable and try to reconfigure whatever the issue is in a way that people are comfortable with it and avoid being positional. And I think that's why I love working at CYFN. It at times can be challenging, but it's always rewarding. And we make space for everybody. We've done that for the 30 years I've been there.
For sure. And you mentioned collaboration, and today it's more important than ever, I believe, when it comes to dealing with issues, especially when it deals with the reality, especially our youth are facing today. So can you talk a little bit about some of the examples now where we're starting to see the beauty of collaboration, and whether it's the mineral legislation that's happening? You mentioned the First Nations School Board. There's places where, regardless if you have an agreement or not, we're encouraging everyone to be not only taking part and adding their input to it, but also seeing the beauty of the opportunity, right? And I think that at the end of the day, the more that we can get people to understand the beauty of the opportunity, and then those are challenges very similar to the early 70s when people were reluctant to sign these agreements or move on, or let alone ratify. We need to help our people understand the opportunities that they have today, rather than just the challenges, if you will. Can you talk about some of the beauty of just the work that you're doing on, like I said, whether it's mineral legislation or the school board or?
Yeah, I guess there's different types of collaboration. Certainly collaboration with public governments. We've seen tremendous strides in that over the last 20 years. And it made people very uncomfortable on the First Nation side. A lot of legal counsel and leaders when we decided that we would look at supporting devolution. But for us at the time, it was strategically made sense to try to leverage some real benefits from that discussion before devolution was going to happen. And what was happening at that time is that Canada was proposing to negotiate it just directly with YG, and First Nations could be part of the YG team. And really, that's what our land claim agreement says as well. But we had this unique circumstance where we had half the First Nations done their land claim agreements, and the other half weren't. And so it was a real good opportunity for us to force our way to the table and maintain we should be there, which we should have been, and to deal with some real strategic advances in that agreement. And it was quite interesting because I think people realize, including some of the YG people we're working with, were saying, well, it's good you're here because you're doing a great job for all Yukoners. So I think there's good collaboration underway with Yukon government for the things that you just said. The mineral legislation is fascinating. We haven't changed that legislation for over 100 years in any substantive way. And there's been a number of court decisions, Justice Vail, he had a couple of decisions that informed our work over the last little bit. But what's fascinating there is we have over 20 Aboriginal groups, like all the Yukon First Nations, whether you're self-governing or not, the transboundary groups, the Nunavut, the Taku River Tlinkits, the Casca from British Columbia as well, some of the Teltans, some of the Dene groups in the Northwest Territories and the Gwich'in. And working with Yukon government around a table and breaking down issues and saying, okay, how do we go about doing this? And how do we do something different? How do we have a more balanced legislation that truly reflects the diversity of interests in the Yukon? For me, that's extremely rewarding. Some of the other collaboration, which I think is also we shouldn't overlook, is collaboration within communities or amongst First Nation communities. Mm-hmm. Some of the things that we do now on the ECDEV side, which I think is fascinating, I think that's people are seeing some of the benefits of that of using our money to really shape and change our communities. Some of the examples that I can point out, we are now almost the majority shareholder in NBD, which is a company worth 140 million. They're now in the last 5-8 years investing money in rural Yukon, not just in Whitehorse, investing in things like the Bedrock or the Downtown Hotel or the CarMax gas station and hotel, and seeing the jobs and the services and the better services that are being provided through those type of enterprises is rewarding as well. Like previously you go to Dawson and there would be nowhere to eat. The hotels are rotated amongst themselves and stay open, but there was no restaurant. The downtown stays open now, and for us that's important. And I think that kind of collaboration we wouldn't be able to achieve individually, but collectively we can when we throw our money together. Some of the other things that I've seen individually within communities is communities coming together, irrespective of whether you supported the land claim or not. And I've seen this in a number of communities. People come together to manage their money, through trusts, and you can say, okay, whether you supported the agreement or not, this money is for your great-grandchildren, and we need to manage it in a sensible way. We need to manage it in the same way we managed our caribou or our salmon or our berry patches, which is you take what you need today and you let the rest grow and expand for future generations. And you take those principles and you apply them, and it makes sense for people. They're like, okay, we can do that. And I think that's the path of strengthening the collaboration within First Nations, and it allows us then to be stronger to collaborate on a larger scale with governments and businesses. And I'm proud of that work. That's still growing, and there's some things that Yukon government has done which has been very helpful, like the First Nations procurement strategy, but it's had some pushback from industry. But I think now industry is seeing there's some value for that, and that if Yukon businesses are doing well, whether it's First Nation business or not, it's benefiting us all. And I'm starting to see some of that movement in the business community, and I'm hoping it grows.
For sure. And you talked about the importance of understanding and education of our agreement, especially for newcomers to the territory. How important is it for our youth, First Nation youth in particular, Yukon First Nation citizens that are younger, to understand and appreciate not only their involvement, but the opportunity that they have to flourish and become the people and find the success that they want for themselves?
Well, I think it's critical, and you see a lot of kids, young people today that really struggle with identity. Where do they belong in the world? What's their place? And this is their place, right? Yeah. This is the room they should be in. This is their calling. I felt a real advantage when I went to university. I went to UBC when I was pretty young. I went there when I was 17, and I graduated when I was 21, and I went straight to law school. I went to this great law school that Ron Vale also went to. He always points it out, University of Toronto. And I came out of there, and I was like 24. But I felt I had an advantage over every other kid at school, because a lot of people were like, well, I'm not really sure what I'm going to do. I knew what I was going to do, and I knew where I was going to go. And I almost wavered from it when I was in Toronto. I had some job interviews lined up, because you get sucked into this whole thing of success is getting interviews and jobs on Bay Street. And so I had some interviews that were lined up, and because they can only phone you within a certain period of time, and everybody runs back to their friends, did you get interviews? And it's very competitive. And I got a phone call out of the blue, and it was like divine intervention almost. And before I confirmed the interviews, Shirley Abson phoned me up, and she said, she was working for Tonquitchin Council, and she said, Daryn, do you want to come work with us for the summer? And I said, doing what? And she said, working on our constitution. We're going to start our land claim discussions. And I had done a little bit of work with them previously, and I was like, yeah, I'd love to do that. And I'm a big shot. Well, how much is that? How much are you going to pay me? And she's like, such and such. And it's tax-free. I'm like, okay, I'm there. And so then I felt terrific, because I had to phone back all these law firms and go decline all their interviews. I was like, yeah, no, I'm going a different way. And I beat it back to the Yukon as soon as I could to come back and work here. And I worked with government for a year, which I was as an articling student apprentice, basically as a lawyer. And I really enjoyed that. I got to learn a bunch of skills from people that that had a lot of experience, and I had a real privilege of working with the judges for a year. And I worked with Judge Buzz Hudson for a year, and it was a fantastic experience to spend time with a gentleman who was a lawyer and a judge for 40-some years probably. Mm-hmm. And got to know Judge Madison as well, which he sets you pretty straight right away on a number of things. So I enjoyed that. But I always knew I'd come here, and I'd be not necessarily sitting here, but sitting with other people and doing this work. And when I saw years earlier, I saw Dave and Mike and all the others leaders, it inspired me. And that's what you got to get across to people. There's young people. There's a place here, but I also remember that it's important for us to reach out to them, and you got to recruit them because they have so many opportunities. They can go work in Ottawa, they can work in Vancouver, they can work wherever. But our young people need to come back and they need to work with us. Mm-hmm. But we need to ensure that it's a competitive environment, that they're in a place where they're doing meaningful work. And we've got some challenges like everybody else in the Yukon about affordability of houses, about ensuring that our kids get good educations, and ensuring that our young people are raised in a place where they're not going to go out for a party in the night and something really bad's going to happen to them. Mm-hmm. We need to deal with those issues. And I think we are. But I think young people, the more they learn about our history, the more pride they have in who they are. And things are so different than when I was a kid, where kids now are involved in dance groups, and our culture is a lot more out there, right?
That's right.
And that's such an awesome thing to see, and it's embraced. And just people wearing their regalia and like the beadwork. Like, my God, think of the beadwork that when I grew up, as grandmas did beadwork, and now young people are doing artwork, right? Like, it's fantastic stuff. It's unbelievable. And I think all that, is people, young people, I hope, feel the same pull to come home that I did. Go away, learn, get the skills, get the experience, get different perspectives, but we need you back here. We really do. Mm-hmm. Nobody's going to do the work that we do as well as we do, other than us.
No, and I appreciate that 100%. Just in regards to 1973 to now, how much has our relationship with Ottawa changed since the period of that time?
Well, I think from what I can read when I go back, things have changed dramatically, right? We're up on our own two legs. We have the resources and decisions that we make about how we spend money, and how we what the priorities are for our communities. We build communities that make sense for us. They're not DIA houses here and there and everywhere else. I go to a place like Quanland Down and see some of the fantastic work they do. I see some of the TON buildings here in Whitehorse. I go to my own community in Dawson and see our terrific subdivision when you come across the bridge, along there. And I see a healthy, strong community. And that's all getting away from Ottawa. Mm-hmm. The people in Ottawa don't know who we are. They don't know what we want. They don't know about our connection, our relationship. And certainly somebody comes up here as a director general for a stint, in the 80s and 70s for 3 or 4 years to work here and then go somewhere else. They don't know us either. Mm-hmm. I think there's a lot of intentioned people who work for the federal government, and I work with them day after day, and I really appreciate that opportunity. And for the people that really try to make a difference, they can make a difference. But the biggest difference is they've got a smaller role in our day-to-day lives in the work that we're doing. If they can support it, great. Mm-hmm. But nobody in Ottawa is making decisions as to what resolutions or laws are passed by TTC or the Trudeau, right? Yeah. Because under the Indian Act, it had power of disallowance. First Nation Council could pass the Whitehorse Indian Band could pass a resolution, and if the minister didn't agree with it, they could kibosh it. They could disallow it. Those days are long gone, and thankfully they are. And I think that's a real significant difference. It's been a difficult journey for First Nations to embrace self-government because it's pretty overwhelming. I think at the beginning, and we've all heard people say, "God, I hate this self-government. We should just go back to being an Indian band. Life was easier then." Yeah, it was. Somebody else made all the bad decisions for us, right? Yeah. It's hard work to be in government and to make those decisions and be accountable to your citizens when you are an elected official or a technical rep and you make a recommendation or a decision, not everybody in your community is going to like it. But hopefully it's the best decision as a community as a whole.
For sure. From your perspective, what are some of the biggest challenges that Yukon First Nations are going to uphold in the next 10 to 15 years? I know we're talking energy, and we had Jay Massey here just in regards to the growth of our communities, let alone, the next big mine or the progression into the electric world, if you will. What will be some of the challenges that our First Nations will be dealing with in the near future?
Yeah, Jay's correct. There's some issues around, of course, our communities are growing at a very high level. I'm not worried about that. We've got good people. We've got the resources. We have agreements with Canada and the Yukon government to deal with those issues. The biggest challenge I have are the challenges we've always had, which is the education of our kids, about helping families that are under stress and perhaps fragmenting, because we lose those kids into a child welfare system and they end up in a prison system. We know that. Everybody in this room is Aboriginal, understands that. And then, of course, the scariest thing that I don't want to be a downer to these discussions, but I am terrified to see what's happening to people under the age of 35 and 40. And to lose that many people in those circumstances is really, really, I don't even have words for it. It's gut wrenching. And we're losing people who are at a position where they're entering their most productive years of their lives about what they can give back to our communities. They can be hockey coaches, they can be mothers, they can be parents, and they're losing them. We're losing them. So I don't know what we're doing or what we're not doing, but we got to do something, and we need to deal with it squarely. And I think that's the biggest challenge. Like, I look behind me, and I'm 54 years old now, which can't believe I'm that old. and when I look back, and we've got a whole bunch of lawyers now, First Nation lawyers, and that's fantastic. But we're losing a lot of community people, and that's really, really tough. They're not having the opportunity to turn their life around because of decisions that are being made, and I think that's a challenge. And I think all of us are thinking in our quiet moments of, what do we do? Yeah. What do we do? I think on the education side, we have a First Nation school board. We have a Yukon First Nation education directorate. I feel comfortable. I've done a lot of work with them. I know there's good people there. Our trustees are in a good spot. We have a good working relationship with the Yukon government. We're developing one with the government of Canada. I feel good about that. There's a lot of work to be done there, but the process is in place now for us to really tackle that issue. On the child welfare, there's a lot of issues there to still be done, but there's some tools that we need to pick up and start dealing with. But on the other issue of young people and the impacts of addictions and toxic drugs, it's a challenge, and it's something that none of us anticipated or saw on the horizon. Yeah. And I probably feel like a lot of people in this room, where we've done this work, which has been rewarding and personally gratifying and everything else, and our culture's been revitalized, and we look back and we open up the newspaper, turn on the radio, and something else has happened in the community again. And you're like, what's going on? What do we do all this work for if this is still happening? So in short answer, that's, I think, the biggest issue we have right now. It's an emergency. It's something we need to deal with quickly, because it doesn't seem like it's slowing down. In fact, it seems like it's accelerating. Yeah.
No, and I share those perspectives as well. Just to wrap things up, Daryn, I know that you've been very instrumental, along with Melanie Bennett, when it comes to the First Nation School Board, and we've been able to, regain some of the nations back into this opportunity. For the ones that are now being canvassed, if you will, in regards to the potential of having the school board be, within their community, within the school system, can you, in an elevator pitch, if you will, can you tell us why communities should at least entertain the thought of joining the school board and the advantages of that?
Sure, and I think that's a positive way to end this discussion, looking forward on that. First Nations School Board is an agreement that's between the Yukon government and a number of First Nations who have signed on. And there's a Chiefs committee that's involved in working with Melanie, and she's providing all sorts of terrific services to all the schools in the Yukon through wraparound services, whether it's therapeutic issues, whether it's educational issues, whether it's support for kids. The bottom line for us is that most of us, when we walk into a school, it doesn't feel comfortable for us. We're not part of the school as parents or uncles or aunts, and that needs to change. And I think the way it changes is that we need to be more involved in the schools. And as an interim step, we've proposed that our First Nations school board be established. And the key thing about a First Nations school board that a lot of people don't realize is that a school council makes recommendations to the minister, to the Yukon government, and has very little, if any, decision-making power. There's elections, but really not a lot can really be done through a school council. It's a great way for YG to be able to get some feedback and some input from parents, and they can have parent advisory groups and things of that sort. The First Nations school board is fundamentally different. It can make decisions with respect to hiring, firing, evaluation of staff members and principals and administration. It can deal with program delivery issues. It can deal with budget allocations. And at the moment, there's 8 schools that are under the First Nations school board. And I really feel if people want to be able to be in a position, or if communities want to be in a position where they can make decisions about the operation and management of their community school, First Nations School Board is a good step. Mm-hmm. It may not be the ultimate step. Maybe we move along ultimately to a First Nations school system. But as a partnership and collaboration, as we were just talking about, it's a good step forward. And we can, we can't vilify the Yukon government or teachers or anything else. Just like everything else that we've done as Aboriginal people, if we want to do it well, we got to do it ourselves. Mm-hmm. And that's what self-government is, whether it's taking care of your money or taking care of your lands. And so we need to step up, just like we need to step up for child welfare and these other issues we've been speaking about. But on the education side as well, we need to do that. And I'm optimistic. Change is not going to happen quick when it comes to the school system, but there has been some changes, and I think they are meaningful. But people need to be concerned because the stats just don't bear out that our school system is where we would want our kids to be at. And it's not just for First Nation kids, it's very pronounced for Aboriginal kids, but for children of the general population, their numbers as well, when it comes to graduation, are not where they should be. And I think all parties recognize that. And I'm really proud of the people who stepped up as trustees in the last election, because they're doing exactly that. They're stepping up and trying to make a difference. And one of the things that the First Nations School Board has made very clear is they're not really interested in controlling and the management and operation of schools. So, because if I was living in Ross River, I'd be like, okay, well, why do I want a First Nation school board in Whitehorse operating my school? It's the same thing as Department of Education. What we're intending to do is to have a delegation of all those powers from the First Nation school board to the communities. So it's the communities would have their own community committees to exercise those powers on behalf of the First Nation School Board, to have all the powers of hiring and firing and evaluations and allocation of budgets and all those other matters. So in the end, it's really the grassroots of those particular communities, which it should be, who are responsible for the operation and management of those schools. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a really effective way, and I really appreciate the willingness of the Yukon government to look at that model and work with us to implement it. And I think it's positive. And I think we'll see some good outcomes a couple years from now. Because the sad reality right now is that a lot of our young people just aren't going to school. Yeah. And I'm not talking about kids in high school. I'm talking about kids in elementary school and grade 6, grade 7, grade 8, just not going to school. And can you imagine the position you are if you're not going to school in today's age, where that leaves you? Mm-hmm. Not in a good place for future job perspectives. And that's where you can see people slipping a little bit and ending up in these other issues we're talking about, with often tragic or life-changing consequences of making bad decisions when you're younger. So if we can have a First Nation school system where communities support it, where it really does reflect who we are. It reflects our perspective, the way we teach school, reflects our languages. Hopefully those kids are on a track for success, that they're placed for success going forward. And I really believe that. And I encourage people to not only look at the First Nation School Board, but to support it, because I think it can make a big, big difference. So thank you very much.
Awesome stuff, Daryn. I just want to thank you very much personally for your commitment to not only the Council of Yukon First Nations, but also to all Yukon First Nations at the end of the day, because without that support, especially from a legal perspective, it doesn't really mean much if we're not all in this together. So a little token of our appreciation for your time today, but other than that, big round of applause for Daryn Leas. Cheesh.